On a Tuesday morning in March of 1975, a 46-year-old rancher named Curtis Meacham drove his pickup truck to the Dawson County Co-op in La Mesa, Texas, and bought 6 gallons of rust-proof paint, 40 pounds of galvanized bolts, and a spool of aircraft cable rated for 2,000 pounds. The clerk behind the counter, a young man named Bobby Sanchez, looked at the supplies and then looked at Curtis. "What are you building, Mr. Meacham? A bridge?" "Rebuilding," Curtis said. "My grandfather's windmill." Bobby's eyebrows went up. "That old thing? I drove past your place last week. Thought that tower was about to fall over. It's been standing since It'll stand a while longer once I'm done with it." Bobby shrugged and rang up the purchase. $47.63. Curtis paid cash, same as he always did, and loaded the supplies into his truck. He didn't know it then, but that $47 was the best investment he'd ever make. Let me tell you about that windmill because it's the real hero of this story. Curtis Meacham's grandfather, Elijah Meacham, had homesteaded 640 acres in Dawson County back in The land was flat and dry, and so far from anywhere that the nearest town was a 2-day ride on horseback. But Elijah had something most homesteaders didn't have: a knack for finding water. In 1911, after 3 years of hauling water from a creek 6 miles away, Elijah hired a well driller from Lubbock to sink a shaft on his property. They hit water at 180 feet, clean, cold, sweet water that seemed to have no bottom. The driller said it was connected to the Ogallala Aquifer, an underground ocean that stretched from Texas to South Dakota. But having water 180 feet underground doesn't do you much good if you can't get it to the surface. Elijah solved that problem in He ordered a windmill from the Air Motor Company in Chicago, a 50-foot tower with an 8-foot wheel shipped in pieces by rail to Big Spring and hauled the last 40 miles by wagon. It took Elijah and his 2 brothers 3 weeks to assemble it, working from hand-drawn diagrams and a lot of cursing. When they finally got the wheel mounted and the pump connected, they stood back and watched the West Texas wind do what it had done for millions of years. The wheel turned, the pump rod rose and fell, and water, beautiful, life-giving water, came pouring out of a pipe and into a stock tank that had been dry for a month. Elijah Meacham's windmill pumped water every single day for the next 63 years. It pumped through the droughts of the 1910s, when other homesteaders gave up and moved away. It pumped through the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when the sky turned black and the cattle died standing up. It pumped through World War II, when Elijah's sons went off to fight and the old man worked the ranch alone. It pumped through the 1950s drought, the worst in Texas history, when Lake Dallas went dry and ranchers shot their cattle because they couldn't feed them. It pumped and pumped and pumped, asking nothing but wind, which West Texas had in endless supply. By 1975, the windmill was showing its age. The tower was rusted, the wheel was bent. The pump leathers were worn so thin that half the water leaked back down the shaft before it reached the surface. Curtis's father, Harold, had stopped maintaining it in 1968, when he'd installed an electric submersible pump that could pull twice as much water with a fraction of the effort. "That old windmill's done its job," Harold had told Curtis back then. "Time to let it rest." Harold died in 1972, leaving the ranch to Curtis. By then, the windmill was just a landmark, a rusty tower that the cattle used for shade and the birds used for nesting. Nobody thought about tearing it down, but nobody thought about fixing it either. Then came the Arab oil embargo of Let me tell you what 1973 felt like if you were a rancher in Texas. In October of that year, the Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Within weeks, the price of oil quadrupled. Gas stations ran dry. The president went on television and asked Americans to turn down their thermostats. For ranchers like Curtis, the crisis hit in a different way. Electricity prices spiked. Diesel fuel became hard to find at any price. The submersible pump that had replaced his grandfather's windmill was suddenly costing him $200 a month to operate, and that was when the power stayed on. Curtis started thinking about that old windmill. He thought about how it had pumped water for 60 years without using a drop of oil or a watt of electricity. He thought about how his grandfather had survived droughts that killed other ranchers, all because he had a way to get water that didn't depend on anything except the wind. He thought about it all through 1974, as electricity prices kept climbing, and the politicians kept talking about energy independence without doing anything about it. And in March of 1975, Curtis Meacham made a decision. He was going to rebuild his grandfather's windmill. Now let me pause here and tell you something about Curtis Meacham, because you need to understand the kind of man he was. Well, Curtis was not what you'd call a romantic. He didn't care about history or heritage or preserving the old ways for their own sake. He cared about one thing: what worked. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that a windmill worked. It worked when the power was on, and it worked when the power was off. It worked when diesel was cheap, and it worked when diesel was expensive. It worked when everything else failed, because it ran on the one thing West Texas would never run out of: wind. So Curtis spent 3 months rebuilding that windmill. He replaced every rusted bolt. He straightened the wheel and balanced it so it would spin in the lightest breeze. He installed new pump leathers and repacked the gearbox with fresh grease. He painted the whole tower with rust-proof paint, not because he cared how it looked, but because he wanted it to last another 60 years. By June of 1975, the windmill was working again. Curtis could hear it from his bedroom at night, the slow creak of the wheel turning, the rhythmic clank of the pump rod, the splash of water into the stock tank. It was the sound his grandfather had heard, and his father had heard, and now he was hearing it too. The sound of independence. Let me tell you about the reaction from his neighbors, because that's where the trouble started. Curtis Meacham's ranch sat on a county road that connected La Mesa to the small community of Patricia, about 15 miles to the north. It wasn't a busy road, but enough people drove past every day that the windmill was impossible to miss. And people had opinions about it. What in the hell is Curtis doing? His neighbor Roy Dawkins asked one morning at the coffee shop in town. Roy had a ranch about 2 miles south of Curtis's place, and he'd watched the rebuilding project with increasing disbelief. "That thing's an eyesore. Looks like something out of a history book. Maybe he's going crazy," said Pete Morrison, another rancher. "You know, old-timer's disease. My uncle had it, started doing all kinds of weird stuff before he died." "Curtis isn't crazy," said Vernon Hayes, who ran the feed store. "He's just cheap. Doesn't want to pay for electricity." "Well, he's making the rest of us look bad," Roy said. "I've got buyers coming from Dallas next month to look at some cattle. You think they want to drive past that rusty junk heap on their way to my place?" The complaints started small, comments at the coffee shop, jokes at the co-op, but they grew over time. By 1978, Roy Dawkins had organized a petition asking Curtis to tear down the windmill, or at least paint it so it wasn't such an eyesore. 37 people signed it. Curtis looked at the petition, looked at Roy, and said 4 words: "It's my property. It's affecting all of our property values." Roy shot back, "Nobody wants to buy land next to a junkyard. Then don't sell." "Curtis, be reasonable. We're not asking you to do anything crazy. Just take down that old tower. You've got a perfectly good electric pump." Curtis folded up the petition and handed it back to Roy. "My grandfather built that windmill in It pumped water through the Dust Bowl when half the county dried up and blew away. It pumped water through the 50s drought when your father lost 200 head of cattle." He paused. "I'm not tearing it down because it makes your driveway look prettier." Roy's face went red. "You're going to regret this, Curtis. When that thing falls over and kills somebody, don't come crying to us. It's not going to fall over. I rebuilt it myself. Oh, that makes me feel so much better." A 63-year-old windmill rebuilt by a man who thinks it's still 9. Curtis didn't say anything to that. He just turned around and walked back to his truck. But Roy wasn't finished. Over the next few years, he made Curtis's life as difficult as he could. He complained to the county commissioner about the windmill being a safety hazard. He called the Texas Railroad Commission and claimed the well was improperly permitted. He even contacted a lawyer about whether Curtis could be forced to remove a public nuisance from his property. Nothing worked. The windmill was on Curtis's land, properly permitted, and not bothering anyone except Roy Dawkins's sense of aesthetics. But the social pressure was real. Curtis stopped getting invited to neighborhood barbecues. People would cross the street to avoid talking to him in town. His own brother, Dale, who had a ranch 30 miles away, told him he was embarrassing the family. "Just tear it down," Dale said one Christmas. "It's not worth all this trouble." "It's not trouble to me," Curtis said. "It's just wind. Let me tell you about the economics, because this is where the story gets interesting." By 1980, Curtis Meacham had been running his grandfather's windmill for 5 years. In that time, his electricity bill for water pumping had been exactly $0. His neighbor Roy Dawkins, meanwhile, was paying about $350 a month to run his submersible pump, more during the summer when the cattle needed more water, and the air conditioning pushed everyone's rates higher. That worked out to about $4,200 a year, or $21,000 over 5 years. Curtis had invested maybe $500 in parts and paint to rebuild the windmill. Roy had spent $21,000 electricity, but nobody wanted to hear about that. "Sure, you're saving money," Roy said when Curtis pointed out the math. "But you're also living in the past. What happens when that thing breaks down? You going to order parts from 1912? I can fix anything on that windmill with hand tools and parts from the hardware store. Can you say the same about your submersible pump? I don't need to fix my pump. That's what the electric company is for. And when the electric company can't help you," Roy laughed. "When's that going to happen?" "This is America, Curtis. The power doesn't just go out." Curtis didn't argue. He'd learned that arguing with Roy was like arguing with a fence post. You might feel better afterward, but the fence post wasn't going to change its mind. Instead, he just kept maintaining his windmill, greasing the gears, replacing worn parts, making sure the wheel was balanced and the tower was solid. He'd go out there in the evening sometimes, after the day's work was done, and just watch it turn, the same way his grandfather had watched it 70 years ago. The wheel would spin, the pump would clank, the water would flow. It didn't care about electricity prices or county commissioners or neighbors with petitions. It just worked. Fast forward to the summer of 1987, because that's when everything changed. Let me tell you what the summer of 1987 was like in Texas. It started hot in May and got hotter. By June, temperatures in West Texas were hitting 110 degrees every day. The ground cracked. The grass turned brown, then gray, then disappeared entirely. Cattle stood in whatever shade they could find, too hot to eat, barely able to walk to water. July was worse. The heat wave that had started in Texas spread across the entire Southwest and into the Plains states. Phoenix hit 122 degrees. Las Vegas hit 116. What 2 degrees? 122 degrees. What has Vegas hit 116? What 2 degrees? What has Vegas hit 116? What has Vegas hit 116? What 2 degrees? What has Vegas hit 116? 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 In Dallas, the power grid started to buckle under the strain of 1 million air conditioners running full blast, and then the rolling blackouts began. Let me explain what a rolling blackout is, because most people have never experienced one. When the demand for electricity exceeds the supply, power companies have 2 choices. They can let the whole grid crash, which means everyone loses power for days or weeks, or they can deliberately cut power to some areas to reduce demand, rotating the outages so no one place goes dark for too long.
That's a rolling blackout.
The power goes out for a few hours, then comes back on, then goes out again. You never know when it's coming or how long it will last. For people in cities, rolling blackouts were an inconvenience. You couldn't run your air conditioning. If your food might spoil, you had to sit in the dark and sweat. For ranchers, rolling blackouts were a disaster. Cattle need water. In the summer heat, a 1,000-pound steer will drink 20 gallons a day or more. If you've got 500 head, which is what Curtis Meacham ran, that's 10,000 gallons of water every single day, no exceptions. Electric pumps don't work when the power is out. The first blackout hit Dawson County on July 5th. The power went out at 2 p.m., right in the hottest part of the day, and didn't come back on until midnight. 10 hours without water for cattle that were already heat-stressed and dehydrated. Roy Dawkins lost 6 head that day. They just dropped in the pasture, too weak to walk to shade, their blood thick as syrup from dehydration. The second blackout hit on July 18th. This time it lasted 14 hours. The third blackout hit on July 22nd, 18 hours. By the end of July, Roy Dawkins had lost 43 cattle. Pete Morrison had lost 51. The Hendricks family, who ran a dairy operation north of Patricia, lost their entire milking herd, 220 cows dead in a single week. And Curtis Meacham? Curtis Meacham hadn't lost a single animal. His grandfather's windmill didn't care about rolling blackouts. It didn't care about power grids or electricity demand or any of the things that were killing cattle all over West Texas. It just kept turning, day and night, pulling water from 180 feet underground and pouring it into a stock tank that never went dry. The wind blew, the wheel turned, the water flowed, same as it had in the Dust Bowl, same as it had every single day for 75 years. Now let me tell you about the day the neighbors came, because that's the part of the story that Curtis never forgot. It was August 3rd, 1987. The temperature was 112 degrees. The power had been out for 6 hours and wasn't expected back until evening, if then. The weatherman said the heat wave might last another 2 weeks. Curtis was in his barn, working on a tractor, when he heard vehicles coming up his driveway. He walked out into the sunlight and squinted at the dust cloud approaching from the county road. It was Roy Dawkins's truck. Behind it was Pete Morrison's truck. Behind that was a station wagon Curtis didn't recognize, and behind that was a pickup pulling a horse trailer that had been converted to carry 50-gallon drums. Curtis counted the vehicles as they pulled into his yard, 12 of them, more coming down the road behind. Roy Dawkins got out of his truck and walked toward Curtis. He was carrying a 5-gallon bucket in each hand. For a long moment, neither man said anything. The windmill creaked behind Curtis, the wheel turning slowly in the hot breeze, the pump clanking its steady rhythm. Water splashed into the stock tank, overflowing onto the ground. "Curtis," Roy said finally. "Roy, I need water." Roy's voice was hoarse, not from thirst, from something else. From having to say those words to this particular man. "My cattle are dying. I've lost 60 head in the last 2 weeks. I've got another 200 that won't make it through the night if I can't get them water." Curtis looked at the bucket in Roy's hands. Then he looked at the line of vehicles behind him. 20 now, with more still coming. He saw faces he recognized. People who had signed Roy's petition. People who had called his windmill an eyesore, a junkyard, a disgrace. People who had laughed at him for 12 years. "I've got a stock tank that holds 10,000 gallons, Curtis said slowly. "My windmill pumps about 15 gallons a minute. That's enough to keep my cattle alive and refill the tank overnight." He paused. "It's not enough for the whole county." "I know." Roy's voice cracked. "I'm not asking for the whole county. I'm asking for whatever you can spare. I'll pay you, whatever you want." Curtis thought about the petition. 37 signatures asking him to tear down his grandfather's windmill. He thought about Roy calling him crazy, calling him cheap, calling him an embarrassment to the community. He thought about 12 years of jokes and cold shoulders and being treated like something that had crawled out of the past. Then he thought about Roy's cattle, 200 animals that had never signed any petition, never called anyone names, never done anything except stand in the heat and wait for someone to bring them water. "I don't want your money," Curtis said. Roy's face fell. He thought he was being refused. "I want your help," Curtis continued. "There's a hand pump on the well casing for when the windmill's being serviced. 2 men working that pump can pull another 10 gallons a minute. I want you and Pete and whoever else to take shifts on that pump. We'll run it 24 hours a day until the power comes back." Roy stared at him. "You're going to help us? I'm going to let you help yourselves. My grandfather built this windmill to pump water. He didn't build it to pump water only for Meachams." Curtis looked at the line of trucks, at the people standing beside them with buckets and barrels and hope in their eyes. "Line up at the tank. Take what you need. But when you're done filling your containers, you take a turn at the hand pump. Everyone works. Everyone drinks. That's the deal." Roy Dawkins set down his buckets. He looked at Curtis for a long moment, at this stubborn old man who he'd mocked and petitioned and tried to pressure into submission for more than a decade. Then he stuck out his hand. "Thank you," Roy said. "I mean it. Thank you." Curtis shook his hand. "Don't thank me. Thank my grandfather. He's the one who had the sense to build something that works." Let me tell you what happened over the next 2 weeks, because it changed Dawson County forever. For 14 days, Curtis Meacham's ranch became the center of the community. From dawn to midnight, a line of vehicles stretched down his driveway, waiting to fill containers at the stock tank. Beside the well, teams of 2 took 30-minute shifts on the hand pump, pulling water from the aquifer while the windmill kept turning overhead. Curtis organized the whole operation. He set up a schedule, so no one had to wait more than an hour. He rigged up extra hoses, so multiple vehicles could fill at once. He even slaughtered 2 of his own steers to feed the people who were working the pump shifts, because some of them had come from 20 miles away and couldn't go home between turns. By the end of the first week, the routine was smooth. Trucks would pull in, fill their containers, and the drivers would take their shift at the pump before heading home. Some people started bringing food to share. Someone set up a canopy for shade. The Hendricks family, who had lost their dairy herd and had nothing left to save, came anyway and worked double shifts because they wanted to help. It was hard work. The hand pump was brutal in the heat. 30 minutes of constant pulling, your arms and back screaming, sweat pouring off you faster than you could drink. But people did it. They did it because their cattle were alive and their neighbors' cattle were alive, and it was better than sitting at home watching everything die. And through it all, the windmill kept turning. Day and night, in scorching heat and blazing sun, the wheel spun, and the pump clanked, and the water flowed. 75 years old, and it never missed a beat. The power finally came back for good on August 17th. The heat wave broke 2 days later, and the first rain in 2 months fell on August 22nd. When it was over, the county extension agent did a survey of livestock losses. Dawson County had lost over 2,000 cattle to the heat wave and blackouts, about 15% of the total herd. Curtis Meacham's neighbors, the ones who had filled their tanks at his well, had lost a combined total of 106 head. The ranchers who lived too far away to make the trip to Curtis's place had lost 10 times that. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because that's when Curtis finally got something he'd never asked for. A week after the rain came, Roy Dawkins drove up to Curtis's place. He wasn't carrying buckets this time. He was carrying a bottle of whiskey and a piece of paper. Curtis met him in the yard, same as before. But something was different now. The tension that had been between them for 12 years was gone. "I brought you something," Roy said. He held up the paper. "Remember this?" Curtis looked at it. It was the petition from 37 signatures asking him to tear down his grandfather's windmill. "I remember." Roy tore the petition in half. Then he tore it again, and again, until it was nothing but confetti. He let the pieces fall to the ground. "I was wrong," Roy said. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about that windmill. I was wrong about everything." He held up the bottle of whiskey. "This is my apology. It's not enough, but it's a start." Curtis looked at the torn pieces of paper scattered in the dust. Then he looked at Roy. "Come inside," Curtis said. "I'll get some glasses." They sat on Curtis's porch and drank whiskey and watched the windmill turn. The storm had cleaned the air, and you could see for miles in every direction, flat brown land stretching to the horizon, dotted with cattle that were alive because of a machine built in 19... "Can I ask you something?" Roy said. "Go ahead."
Why did you help us?
"After everything we did, the petition, the complaints, all the years of giving you grief, why didn't you just tell us to go to hell?" Curtis was quiet for a long time. He watched the windmill's wheels spin, listened to the creak and clank that had been the soundtrack of his life for as long as he could remember. "My grandfather was 23 years old when he built that windmill," Curtis said finally. "He'd been in Texas for 4 years, lost his first wife to typhoid, lost his first herd to drought. Everyone told him to give up, go back east where there was water and shade and civilization." He took a sip of whiskey. "But he didn't give up. He sank a well, built a windmill, and made this land into something. And when the Dust Bowl came and half the county dried up and blew away, my grandfather opened his well to anyone who needed water. Didn't charge them a cent. Just let them take what they needed to survive. I didn't know that. Most people don't. It was a long time ago." Curtis set down his glass. "My grandfather used to say that a man doesn't own water. Water comes from God, through the ground, and a man's just the one who figures out how to get it to the surface. If you're lucky enough to have a well that flows, you share it. That's not charity. That's just being a human being." Roy was quiet for a moment. "I wish I'd known your grandfather. You'd have liked him. Stubborn as hell. Just like me." Curtis smiled. "He probably would have told you where to stick your petition, though." Roy laughed, a real laugh, the first one Curtis had heard from him in years. They finished the bottle as the sun went down, two old men watching a windmill turn against the darkening sky. "Let me tell you what happened in the years after, because the story doesn't end there." Curtis Meacham became something of a local legend after the summer of '87. People would drive out of their way just to see the windmill that had saved Dawson County. School groups came on field trips. The La Mesa newspaper did a feature story. A television station from Lubbock sent a crew to interview Curtis, though he refused to go on camera. "The windmill's the hero, not me," he told the reporter. "Go interview it." But the most important thing that happened was quieter, and you wouldn't have noticed it unless you were looking. Slowly, one by one, windmills started going up all over Dawson County. Roy Dawkins was the first. In the spring of 1988, he hired a crew to sink a new well and install a windmill, not as fancy as Curtis's, but functional. "Backup system," he told people, in case the power goes out again. Pete Morrison was next. Then the Hendricks family, who had rebuilt their dairy operation and weren't about to lose another herd. Then ranchers from neighboring counties who had heard what happened and decided they'd rather have a rusty eyesore than dead cattle. By 1995, there were more windmills in Dawson County than there had been since the 1940s. The county extension agent called it the Windmill Renaissance and wrote a paper about it for an agricultural journal. Curtis just called it common sense. He died in 2003 at the age of 74. Heart attack, same as his father, same as his grandfather. They found him in his yard, sitting in a chair he'd set up facing the windmill, like he'd been watching it turn when his heart gave out. His son Marcus inherited the ranch. First thing Marcus did was have the windmill inspected by an engineer. "How's it look?" Marcus asked when the inspection was done. The engineer shook his head in disbelief. "That tower's 91 years old. The wheel's been rebuilt at least 3 times. The pump mechanism was state-of-the-art in 19... He paused, "and it's still working perfectly. I've never seen anything like it. My dad maintained it every month for 30 years. Before that, my grandfather maintained it for 50. Well, whatever they did, it worked. This thing could run for another 50 years if you keep up the maintenance." Marcus looked up at the windmill, At the rusty tower his father had refused to tear down, the creaking wheel that had turned through drought and blackout and everything else the world had thrown at it. "I planned to," he said. "The windmill is still there today. If you drive down County Road 113 in Dawson County, Texas, you'll see it standing against the sky, a 40-foot tower of iron and steel, older than anyone alive, still pumping water same as it did when Elijah Meacham first got it running in 19. The wheel turns, the pump clanks, the water flows. It doesn't care about electricity prices or power grids or climate change or any of the things that keep people up at night. It just works, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. There's a plaque at the base of the tower now. The Dawson County Historical Commission put it up in It reads, "The Meacham Windmill, built 9. This windmill provided water to over 40 families during the 1987 Texas heat wave, when rolling blackouts disabled electric pumps throughout the region. It remains operational today, a testament to the foresight of Elijah Meacham and the determination of his descendants." Below the plaque, someone, probably Marcus, added a smaller sign with a quote from Curtis: "The wind doesn't send a bill. The wind doesn't go on strike. The wind just blows. And as long as it's blowing, water's coming up." That's the story of the Meacham Windmill, the story of a machine they called a rusty eyesore, a junkyard relic, an embarrassment to the community. The machine that saved 40 families when everything else failed. Here's the thing about old technology. It's not old because it stopped working. It's old because we found something newer. And sometimes newer isn't better. Sometimes newer just means more complicated, more expensive, more dependent on things outside your control. The ranchers who laughed at Curtis Meacham had electric pumps that could move twice as much water with half the effort, but their pumps needed electricity. When the electricity stopped, the water stopped. And when the water stopped, the cattle died. Curtis Meacham's windmill needed nothing but wind. And in West Texas, wind is the one thing you can always count on.